Welcome to The Thread. The Thread is a space for engagement with questions of leadership, global culture and evangelism in this fast-changing world. Brought to you by Alpha and hosted by me, Stephen Foster. And it's wonderful to have you with us today. And our guest on this episode is Louise Perry. And lots of you will have come across Louise's work with her 2022 book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She's also the host of a wonderful podcast, Maiden Mother Matriarch. She's got a book coming out very soon, a kind of young adult version of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, which is called A New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century. And I've just been told that she is going to be a columnist at the Wall Street Journal. And for the last few years, she's written for a number of publications around the world, including the New York Times. It's a wonderful privilege to have Louise Perry with us, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Louise, thank you so much for coming on The Thread.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Louise, so tell us, your book in 2022, just to start there. Some people will have read it, lots of people have read it, but some people might not. Tell us a bit about the idea for that book and what motivated you in writing it.
Well, I suppose the book came out of ideas that I'd been writing around for years beforehand. I was working at the New Statesman at the time when it came out, and also my before I became a journalist, I worked at a rape crisis centre. That's something that I write about in the book has been quite formative for me in terms of learning about, I suppose, learning about the gap between reality and theory when it came to sexual violence. I had become familiar from doing women's studies at university with lots of feminist theory around sexual violence, and I found that actually the relationship between that and the reality wasn't very close, and it made me ask kind of increasingly inconvenient questions from my perspective. And I also worked for a couple of years on a campaign group called We Can't Consent to This, which was around the creeping normalization and even decriminalization of very extreme violence in sexual relationships, and women who died and their killers had been able to claim that they consented to the violence that killed them. And I just felt as if young women in particular, along with everyone else, but young women in particular, were being lied to by the culture about the realities of sex. And so the book was an attempt to put the record straight, I suppose, in saying things that I still think are actually incredibly obvious. And I had a really easy job because I think when dominant ideas are extraordinarily silly and wrong, just pointing that fact out is really low-hanging fruit. But people are desperate for you to do it, I think. So I think that's probably why the book resonated so much.
And one of the themes in the book is that the sexual revolution and lots of the kind of progressivism and the changes in society over the last 50 years, which might be assumed to have empowered or emancipated women more generally, actually might have had the opposite effect in some areas. And could you say a bit about that, and what looking at that literature, and you wanted to be data driven and peer reviewed study driven, what were the key things that you found?
Yeah, so it's called The Cases Against the Sexual Revolution because that's what I'm offering is a critique of the event that we call the sexual revolution, but also of the dominant way of thinking about it, at least on the liberal left, which is that the sexual revolution was an unalloyed good for women. And I don't think it was. I think that to the extent that anyone really benefited from the sexual revolution on net, it was a minority of men. I think that for a lot of men, the costs have been quite severe, and for, I think, probably the vast majority of women, the costs have been quite severe. That doesn't mean that the entire, I am not, for instance, much to the frustration of some of my traditional Catholic readers, I'm not completely anti-contraception. I actually do think that there are ways in which contraception has improved women's lives, including my own. But what I'm trying to offer is an antidote to the view of the sexual revolution that I know I was brought up with, just from the cultural osmosis, that it was an obvious win, that it was a big that the history is shaped like this, and that the progressive project has marched on, and that the sexual revolution, there's nothing to regret about it, and I think there's actually a lot to regret about it.
And one of the things I found fascinating, Louise, is that you wouldn't expect this, but in The Observer, Rachel Cook, amazing writer who sadly died a few weeks ago, but her review of the book is one of the most extraordinary reviews I've ever read in The Observer, because just praises the book in such a powerful way, potent, plain-speaking manifesto. She says at the end of her review, I love this, she says, this is a provocative book. More than once its author says the unsayable. It makes you think, it makes you want for a better world. It's urgent and daring and brave. It may turn out to be one of the most important feminist books of all time. Were you surprised by that reaction? Or
I was so touched by that review. So touched. And particularly because I think Rachel Cook was such a such a wonderful writer, and I read her loyally.
Yeah.
And so to have her review my book in such beautiful terms was amazing. Yeah. I mean, I do also think that I think she mentions at one point in that review that like most feminist writing at the moment on sexual relationships is really bad. It's like really bad. I think that was more true in 2022 than now, because there have been a wave of recent books come out which have been really admirable. But in general, just very the thing that I find really, really frustrating in general, and including in this genre of writing, is people not wanting to say true things because they're worried about getting in trouble for them. And people kidding themselves and kidding others for the sake of maybe imagined political expediency. I really don't like that. I think I'm very annoying about it, honestly. I'm quite obsessive about truth in a way that I think vexes people in my life. But when it comes to, that's why I say I feel like it's low hanging fruit. A lot of what I say in the book, I'm just correcting things which are obviously don't tally with reality and with data, and I thought it was a pretty easy gig, which is why it was very nice of Rachel to be so so fulsome in her praise.
And Louise, I mean, just to take one thing, I mean, you have a chapter called Marriage is Good, and why don't you say a little bit about that? Because maybe there's an assumption that marriage is a bit passé, or we're a bit over marriage, or marriage is a bit restrictive and not necessarily in the best interests of women. But your contention being actually this is monogamous marriage, the best thing often for women and for children. And again, that might be thought to be a controversial thing for a feminist writer to say. So what led you to that conclusion, and what do you think are the implications of it?
I should say that when I wrote this book, I wasn't a Christian. I mean, I was kind of like Christian curious, and was going to church occasionally and so on. But I deliberately set out to write the book from a secular perspective and for a secular audience. And I'm glad I did that, because I think it ends up being more persuasive for that reason. I have since become a Christian, but I still don't think that you have to just you can endorse the Christian model of marriage without needing to quote any scripture whatsoever, right? You can very easily just look at sociological data and conclude that it's the best model. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have trade-offs. It does. There isn't a perfect... There is no means of regulating relationships with human beings that doesn't entail some suffering sometimes. That is unfortunately just life. So there will be bad marriages, of course, always. But what I think the critics of marriage often forget is the problem that it's trying to solve. And the problem that it's trying to solve is having children and what context children ought to be born into. And the vulnerability that women experience, this is why I think the feminist case for marriage is so persuasive, the vulnerability that women necessarily experience as part of having children. You go through a period where you are severely incapacitated by being heavily pregnant, or not heavily pregnant even. I mean, some women have horrendous pregnancies the whole way through, and from having young children and of nursing. And those burdens can't be shrugged off. They can't be exchanged. They can't be transferred to anybody else. They lie entirely on the mother. And the question that the eternal question that women and everybody else has to solve is how do you manage that dependency, that essential dependency that women experience and that children experience, because of children come into the world utterly dependent on other people. I always like that the Donald Winnicott quote, there's no such thing as a baby, there's only a baby and someone, because a baby on his or her own will die within a day, less, right? They need the devoted care of at least one person to stay alive, and that care continues for many years after. And of course, normally it's the mother who provides that care. It can be other people, but it has to be somebody, right? Like the whole process of having children, which we have to do for the species to continue, is fraught with risk. And how does one solve that is a really big problem. And what a lot of socialist feminists have concluded over the years is that the state should solve it, so that women should be, say, given money by the state during periods of dependency, that free childcare should be provided to all children from the moment that they're born. But what I think that does in effect is it takes the functions of the family and transfers that responsibility to the state. But then the state does a very bad job, actually. Like the state can do the bare minimum when it comes to, say, like if you think of the expression I use is the state is like a I can't remember exactly the word I used, a replacement husband. So the state can protect you from violence, just about. The state can provision you with food and housing, just about. The state cannot love you, though, and the state cannot be dependable in the way that other human beings can be. And the state has I generally I have a suspicious attitude towards the state in general, and I think it tends towards exploitation and coercion just by the nature of being an enormous bureaucracy. But how else are we going to solve these problems, right? And I say, look, I think that if the choice that we're faced with is real human beings in real relationship with one another, providing these, being the anchor for women and children in times of dependency, or if it's the state, I think it should be human beings. And I think that actually, if you look at the historical record, the best, and anthropological record. My first degree was in anthropology, so I typically come at these questions from an anthropological one and thinking, let's look across the whole record. Let's not just look at the last 200 years of Western history or whatever and think, how do people solve these problems? And the way that people solve these problems really universally is through some kind of model of marriage. So some kind of public, legal, social commitment that a father makes to the mother of his children, saying, I will provide for you in your moments of dependency. And a less common model, but I think by far the most superior model, if we look across anthropological record, is the monogamous marriage model, where the father commits to just one woman and for life, and promises to provide for her. The problem with the polygamous marriage model, which is the other one that you see across time and place most commonly, is it's actually very bad news for women and children. So this is a section of the book where I go back to the data and look at, say, domestic violence rates in polygamous versus monogamous settings, and child abuse rates and things like that. And yeah, what you end up concluding if you look at this data for long enough is that monogamous marriage is the least worst option. And that might not be a very romantic endorsement, but I think it is a very persuasive one.
Yes.
And looking at all of this from a strictly secular perspective, that actually Christianity, whether through divine inspiration or pure luck, has alighted on the best model possible for everybody, including women and children.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Louise. And you draw out how, in terms of protecting the vulnerable, marriage is a really important thing, and strengthens protection for, as you say, women and children, and particularly vulnerable, those who are vulnerable. I think one of the other things I find still fascinating about the book is its resonance to all sorts of people. So I think I recommended it to everyone I saw for about a year.
Oh.
and everyone pretty much read it, and everyone said, wow, like it feels like it articulated something that people were searching for, kind of an unease or a disconnect they were feeling in society. And I think particularly that's the case for, we have lots of young adults and students in our church and in churches across the UK, but also those outside the church. So people in their 20s who are experiencing dating culture at the moment, and some of the challenges of dating culture, and the struggling with apps and pornography and various things, that it felt like your book diagnosed something which helped people think, oh, it's not just me. It's not just that I'm doing this wrong, or that I'm not very good at dating, that there's something that shifted in the very dynamics of the dating culture. And I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yeah, it's probably the most common question that I get from readers is something like, how do I find a spouse?
Yeah.
And I wish I had I can't really offer a foolproof answer to that. I can give it a go. I can offer some pointers, again, informed more by data than anything else. I think that one of the things that we've learned in the post-sexual revolution era is that matchmaking is actually very difficult, and it's a very complex coordination problem. And again, if we look at other times and places, it's a coordination problem that every society faces and comes up with different solutions. What I think almost no one does except us is just leave young people to their own devices and hope for the best, particularly given access to the internet and all of this. I mean, the feature of our contemporary moment in terms of finding a partner is this abundance of choice, a real excess of choice, so that you go onto an app and you can just swipe infinitely. It's an interesting aspect of human psychology that actually when people are overwhelmed with choice, all the choices become less attractive, and they often feel paralyzed rather than liberated. And also they, actually people don't necessarily know themselves as much as they might think they do, or as much as they might hope to. And what normally happens in other cultures and in our own up until quite recently is that one, the choices are more restricted by circumstances. You don't have the internet and you don't have as much geographical mobility as we do now. So in terms of your access to loads of people, that's reduced. And you're more likely to have the influence of some kind of the people around you in encouraging or discouraging certain matches. That's something that parents now find very alien. The idea that you might have anything to say or any comment to make on your children's choices, including or particularly their romantic choices. But that's a way in which I think we're very different from people in most times and places. It's something I'm just generally very interested in, is looking at. You must have been to the Pitt Rivers Museum.
Yes.
In Oxford. Yeah. My favourite museum in the world. And one of the things that I love about it is it's got this really peculiar way of arranging the items. So in most anthropological museums, so say the one in Paris, they arrange it by geographical area. So you'll go to the Oceania section, or you go to the North African section or whatever, and then you'll see all the exhibits. What the Pitt Rivers does is it groups things by theme, and it has been like that since it was founded. So it still has lots of quite Victorian labels, and it's quite retro, the whole experience. Retro, yeah. But I actually think there's something really beautiful about it, because you will go to, say, the cabinet on boats, and you will see all the different ways in which people across history have come up with a solution to how to make a boat. And then you go to the section on infant carriers. That's my favourite one, where you see all the sort of the papooses and everything that people who have never encountered one another and yet all kind of zeroed in on roughly the same solution, because babies have always needed to be carried, and babies are much of a muchness,
Yeah.
across everywhere. And so what the Pit Rivers does, which I think is wonderful, is it actually highlights the similarities that we share and how we always are faced with pretty much the same problems. Human nature is a fairly fixed quantity, and the challenges that we face are consistent. Even people very modern like us, we face many of the same challenges that our ancestors did. And I think there are lots of ways in which we modern people, we do have a unique experience of life because we're very high tech. We don't really have to worry so much about feeding ourselves and keeping ourselves warm in the way that most people do. We have an abundance of material wealth, but that doesn't mean that we are radically different from people of the past. Like psychologically, we're still basically the same, and our core drives are still basically the same. And I think that if what you often see, particularly when it comes to sex and relationships, is that we are outliers. We have very different approaches to, say, marriage, or to premarital sex, or to matchmaking, or a host of different things. And I think, is that because we are uniquely inspired, or is that because actually we're the ones who've made a mistake? Maybe.
Yeah.
like if everyone else has come up with marriage, say, as a solution to the problem of reproduction, does that maybe suggest that actually it's solving a good problem for a good reason? And I think this about something like matchmaking as well. It doesn't seem to be that our radically modern way of approaching this is working very well, given that everyone is complaining constantly. So.
Yeah. And on that, Louise, in terms of like the power dynamics, one of the things you've said before is that the apps themselves and the kind of marketization of the dating pool, it actually favours quite a small proportion of men, because of the different costs of engaging in sexual activity, men and women, and the different, and so actually the apps and everything else are actually increasing the power of a very small proportion of men, and actually working to the detriment of almost everyone else. And I think that's probably people's experience, but it's quite helpful to have it articulated in quite such clear terms. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, chapter 2 of the book is called Men and Women Are Different. And I think that the insistence among progressives that men and women are not different, or at least are not psychologically different from one another, or even physically different from one another, that we're all, basically the same. There's this line from Ivan Illich, the priest and philosopher. I'm probably misquoting, but it's along the lines of, you've never seen a human body. You've only ever seen a male and a female body. There's no such thing as like a neutral human body. There are two categories of human. They're called male and female. And there are in most ways we are much the same, but there are important ways in which we are subtly different. And mostly those differences are complementary to one another. And there's a lot of overlap. You get outliers in every direction. In the same way that you will sometimes get very tall women and very short men, but men on average are taller than women. You see this across all sorts of domains, and particularly when it comes to sexuality. And what the dating apps do, and what in general the liberated sexual marketplace does, I put liberated kind of in scare quotes, is it provides an enormous amount of freedom and options for the minority of men who have very high sex drives, have a real craving for sexual adventure and variety, and are sufficiently attractive that they can access it. And if anyone's been a winner from the sexual revolution, it's those men. So I use Hugh Hefner as the preeminent example of someone like this, the founder of Playboy magazine. And he, for a substantial period of his life, he was a winner, at least in terms of hedonistic pleasure. And he was a huge proponent of the sexual revolution, and particularly of the decriminalisation of abortion and contraception, and kind of for obvious reasons, like it served his interests personally, and also served the interests of the whole Playboy project, which was all about making women maximally sexually available to men. I still think that in the end, Hugh Hefner wasn't a true winner, maybe in a spiritual sense, in that I think by the time he had aged out of his prime and was no longer glamorous and popular, he lived a fairly sort of undignified life, and there are various accounts that I quote from his the various Playboy bunnies who he lived with, and it's all really very sordid and unpleasant by the end. So I'm not even sure that actually those men, they might want it in the moment, but then this is what we're like. This is what people are like. We often want things in the moment that are bad for us, and we need social guardrails or legal guardrails to channel us towards making better choices. And unfortunately, living in a sort of hyper liberated setting, it often has the effect of liberating the most powerful and the most coercive and the most exploitative, and that doesn't have the effect of liberating the powerless and the vulnerable. Quite the opposite. Freedom for the pike is death for the minnow is the expression that's sometimes used, and I think that describes the liberated sexual marketplace very well.
So fascinating, Louise. And what advice, if you don't mind me asking, if people who are listening to us are in their 20s, maybe longing to find a partner or struggling on the dating scene, I mean, what would your advice be? Would it be get offline? Would it be speak to all your friends and tell them to recommend someone that has good character and virtue? And what would be some of the kind of micro ways that we could, grassroots ways that we could start to build a culture which might make it a bit easier for people in their 20s to find people?
I don't want to be too harsh about the apps, because I do know people who have met their spouses through the apps, and so sometimes it does work. I don't want to be too rigid about that. There's really interesting graphs if you look over time, looking at where people met their spouses at different moments. Sometimes people will talk now, and there was a lot of commentary about this at the time of Me Too and afterwards. They'll talk about the reluctance that men might feel post Me Too to approach women in a bar, say, and ask them out. And I always think that's actually very anachronistic, because that period when it was normal-ish to have that kind of cold approach to someone was really very brief. So maybe in the 1990s, let's say, people might actually go up to someone in a bar and actually, like post-sexual liberation, pre-internet, that was not unheard of. But it's never been the norm. The norm for how you meet your spouse is through people you already know. And there's a lot to be said for it, because it does mean that they're coming with a degree of endorsement, and you can learn things about their history and their character and so on by this social network, which is very difficult to do if someone's just, a profile picture on the internet. There's very little that you can learn about them if you don't have social connections. And they can melt back into the night as well if they mistreat you in some way. The traditional solution to this, and I think there's still a lot to be said for it, is meeting people somehow through people that you already know. That might be friends, that might be church.
Yes.
I mean, in all seriousness, I think going to church probably is an extremely good strategy. Going to a church which has lots of young people, and finding ways of, because if there's a good chance that the people are there because they share your values and are therefore likely to be a good spouse, not just in terms of faith, but all sorts of other things. And I think not being shy about asking for help.
Yeah.
From people that you know, from even from relatives. I think that's quite countercultural.
Yes.
It's normally the interfering busybodies. It's not the expression that my friend Mary Harrington likes to use, the aunties.
Yes.
The older women who are probably paired up themselves and so off the market, and who like to interfere. But actually, I think there's a very important cultural role for the aunties.
Yes.
Because often they actually have insights that they've gained from life experience which young people lack. So I think maybe empowering the aunties and disempowering the apps would be a good route if we could find a way.
That feels like a great catchphrase. And Louise, it'd be great. I mean, you've mentioned church. I'd love to talk a bit about faith and your own faith journey, because I know you grew up and faith wasn't particularly part of your childhood, and then I think you've described yourself as a classic annoying atheist at 13.
Yeah,
Or
I'm afraid so. Yeah.
Say a bit about that. Why do you use that?
I mean, I didn't grow up. I suppose like basically everyone. I grew up in Britain and Australia, and like everyone, I'm sort of exposed to cultural Christianity, and I went to a nominally Church of England school, but I didn't read the Bible, and I didn't go to church, and I didn't have that kind of direct engagement with faith. And yes, I was. I mean, I'm afraid the God delusion came along at exactly that. I was the generation for the God delusion being really hitting me over the head, and I thought it was fantastic. So I had a.
So it's Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it came out when I was 13 or something. So
Yeah.
yes, I was an annoying teenage atheist, and then I gradually, my husband and I got married when we were quite young for our. Not young historically. I was 25, he was 27, which historically is bang on typical. But for our era is on the young side. We met at university as well. I should say that university is also the really obvious way in which you can meet a spouse if you are at university, because you'll never again be surrounded by so many people who are single and who have nothing to do. not wanting to be too rude to students, but like, you are so leisured. You have no idea how leisured you are. This is your moment for devoting yourself to finding a spouse. So anyway, we met at university and then we got married not that long after. And we wanted to get married in church just because it seemed like the traditional thing to do. And one of the things that you're obliged to do if you're getting married in a Church of England church that's outside of your parish is to attend. And so we attended regularly for 6 months or something. And it was a very traditional Anglican church, and then I kept going because I liked it actually, and I liked the music, and I just liked it, and so but felt a bit, I don't know, didn't necessarily say the creed, and felt a bit kind of sat at the back being awkward, but kept going anyway, and then this was at the period when I was writing the book, and so that's where my headspace was at the time. But I did find from writing the book, and maybe at least as much from promoting the book afterwards and having a lot of conversations with people about it, is it made me realise how insightful the Christian teachings on sex relationships are. You might say that that's just accident, or all the good luck of Christianity being a very ancient belief system at this point, and so maybe you would expect there's almost a process of natural selection where belief systems which produce good outcomes tend to flourish, and belief systems that don't produce good outcomes don't. I mean, there's this it's one of the theories put forward by Rodney Stark in his famous book about Rise of Christianity, Early Christianity, that Christians had more children early on, and Christians also killed fewer of their children because they were opposed to abortion and infanticide at a time in the Roman world where both were common. And so probably it is partly the case that Christian teachings on marriage and children ended up causing Christianity's growth early on. But anyway, I ended up concluding, as we've spoken about already, that the Christian guidance is really very good. And you don't have to necessarily believe it to enjoy those good outcomes. But it did make me think, the expression I like to use is that Christianity is sociologically true. And if it's sociologically true, you would expect it to be supernaturally true as well. Or at least, if it was supernaturally true, it would have to be sociologically true as well. Which, to my mind, is pretty good evidence that it is. That it is. that both, might be true. I also, I mean, if you're a cold hard rationalist who's been raised with the scientific method and you struggle a little bit to listen to the Holy Spirit, there are still ways in which you, like for instance, the Turin Shroud. I got really into. My husband's also become Christian in recent years, and we both found reading about the Turin Shroud amazing, and similarly looking at the historicity of the Gospels amazing. Like you actually don't. There's a lot that you can find out as a as a cold hard rationalist, which is actually very persuasive about Christianity. But I didn't know that. I hadn't been exposed to that before, and it took quite a long period of thinking and reading and speaking to people. Also, one of the things I noticed when the book came out, and it had this really amazing response from people, and I had written it very deliberately to be sort of non-partisan when it came to matters of faith. And even of politics. So I was trying to really, I think I've said already, I don't condemn contraception. I don't condemn abortion. I don't condemn same-sex marriage. There are all sorts of things I'm sort of centre ground on, these really contentious subjects. And the thing that I noticed is that people who are at the progressive end of the progressive and secular end of the political spectrum generally didn't like the book. And with some notable exceptions, but generally didn't like the book or didn't engage with it, or were didn't like that I hadn't fully endorsed their values. Whereas Christians were incredibly kind and open-hearted and willing to welcome into conversation someone with whom they disagreed. And I thought that was really amazing, and it made quite a big impression on me. And it made me realise from then having lots of conversations with Christians how much I actually agreed with them. And yeah, so I didn't have a Damascene moment, but I did have a move towards faith that was 80% rational and 20% emotional. I think that was roughly my balance. It's different for everyone, I think.
Yes. It's fascinating, Louise. Absolutely fascinating. And what does that look like in practice for you? If you don't mind me asking, for you, your husband, your children, what as you've been exploring the fact that it's sociologically true and therefore might be supernaturally true, how have you done that? And what journey did you go on? And you started going to church? Did you start going to church as a family? What did it look like?
The sequence was that I went to church on my own for a bit, and then I went to church with our eldest. We've now got two little children, with our eldest as a toddler. And then I started going to a church with friends who also had children, and so that we were kind of scooped up more into the church community in that way. We also have ended up gravitating towards we've now attended two different Holy Trinity Brompton plant churches, and that's the style of worship which we like, largely because it's just so great for children. And I find taking children to a really kind of a more austere style of service with very little provision for children. A lot of churches don't really have provision for children. Some parents are bold enough to just show up with the screaming toddler, and like, I'm not bold enough for that. I like going to a church which is already loud, so that my children don't make it louder, and then being able to go to groups, and it's really great. So anyway, we've ended up going to churches which are very family friendly, and now my husband now comes to church as well every week, and has been for the last year or so. And we now have two children, so we all go to church. And something as well that we've chosen to do is our eldest is starting school soon, and we're going to be sending him to a Christian school, and not just a Christian in name only school, like an actually Christian school where faith is very central to the spirit of the school. And we reason that you can get a long way with the home culture strongly endorsing something, but I think you can get a lot further if you're able to choose a peer group for your children as much as possible where everyone is on the same page. One of the things that we're also concerned about with schools, and this is, I'm sure lots of parents listening will feel the same way, is that feeling anxious about digital devices and children. Ours are kind of too young for it to be an issue, but we one of the issues I write about a lot in the book and elsewhere is porn, and young boys in particular being exposed from a really young age. And we have two little boys, and we want to as far as possible choose a peer group for them via school where parents are faithful Christians who don't want their kids to be exposed to porn. And so the school that we're sending them to is generally anti-smartphone and discourages children from getting them until they're much older. It's an issue I talk about quite a lot on the podcast. I did an interesting interview with Jean Twenge.
Oh yes,
gosh, I always forget how to pronounce her name. Twenge.
iGen, she wrote. I think iGen.
Yeah, lovely woman.
Yes.
And she's written a really, really good and very practical book recently on how to discourage problematic screen use in children and teenagers, which I'd recommend. So. Yes, it's kind of it is kind of connected to this question of trying to. I think that the best way to strengthen your faith is to spend time with people who have strong faith. And I would want to give, it may be that our children as they grow older reject it or go through a period of rejecting it or whatever. But I feel like if we're setting them up to win by giving them access to people and to institutions, which are devout, because we're living in a time where, we're speaking not long after the both abortion up until term, self-administered abortion up until term, and assisted dying were both legalised in Britain, and I think there's a strong feeling among British Christians, which I share, that we're entering a post-Christian age, at least when it comes to governance. And that's not historically unique. There have been many times over the last 2,000 years where Christians have been in that position and still are now all over the world. And sometimes the faith, I think, flourishes most actually during periods of persecution. But it does mean, I think, that you need to be more mindful about. You can't just send your children to a state school and hope for the best, and not, and not. They will be taught things invariably by state institutions which are really hostile, actually, to Christian belief, and trying to manage that as a parent, I think, is really difficult. I'm not sure I've got all the answers. It's what we're all wrestling with, I think.
It's so fascinating for me, Louise, because I think you see the kind of precious nature of the Christian faith as something not to take for granted, and something you want to pass on to your children, young though they are, your boys. And I think sometimes maybe if you've been around it a while, you can slightly take it for granted, or just assume that in some way it will be passed on, and not be intentional in that transmission, and almost particularly for English people, there can be this kind of reticence about everyone gets to make their own decision or take their own choice, and that idol of choice I know you've spoken about. But I think it's so interesting. And what would you say to people who church leaders and people who have maybe don't quite realise the gems that there are in this thing called the Christian faith?
Something that I have observed from reading and writing about these questions is that something that people don't seem to find very attractive is the sort of halfway house. I think there's been an effort by quite a lot of churches to, the old saying that Church of England is the Conservative Party at prayer. I think in recent years it's more like maybe the Lib Dems or the Green Party at prayer. But the idea that if you offer people kind of vaguely nice sounding but not very strongly religious messages around morality and that people will, you might get more bums on seats, but that doesn't really seem to happen. I think it's because if people just want the politics, they can get that elsewhere. Why would they come to church when they could just do any number of other things? Whereas the churches that offer the really full fat version of faith, whatever that might be, it might be traditional Catholicism, or it might be a really raucous evangelical style of worship. But that's something that sort of takes people out of themselves in some capacity, seems to be what people find attractive right now, because you can't just rely on, when you're in an era that is post-Christian, at least in the sense of the mainstream, you can't just rely on everyone showing up and singing the hymns on that kind of default Christianity is really gone. It needs to be something that people actually actively choose, and actively choose to be somewhat countercultural. It's a quirk of human psychology, I guess, that we're seeing now, that people actually, if they're going to do it, they will just go all in.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that sometimes that can be surprising to church leaders who want to offer something that seems a bit more gentle.
Just imagining there'll be people listening to this who might be exploring faith, or have friends who are kind of on that journey. I know you've said before, you've quoted Rowan Williams, one of the best ways to believe is to be around people who are really good at believing. And what sort of things would you encourage to someone who is going on a similar journey to the one you went on kind of taking your steps of exploring and finding faith?
I think to accept the offer of friendship from Christians, and to seek out friendship with Christians. And I guess if you find yourself, I for a long time, I felt like I wish I was a Christian, but I can't be, because I don't believe. And if only I did, and in retrospect, I think that wanting was very important. And I think if you want it, that actually tells you that you're almost there. And then the only further step to take is, I suppose, to learn from other people who are good at believing. This is also another, in some ways we're being very, I know in myself I have a tendency to be very Protestant about this, and to think that the really important thing is your own relationship with the Holy Spirit and your inner experience of faith. But for a lot of people that isn't how it works. And particularly there tends to be a belief among Catholics that what matters isn't actually that internal experience. It's actually the doing. It's the showing up to church, and it's the going to confession, or following Christian teachings in your life and behaving like a Christian is what matters. I think there's a lot of wisdom there. And my own neurotic tendency to kind of nag at what do I really think, what do I really believe, whatever, is in some ways beside the point. If you just behave like a Christian, then you are a Christian, and eventually that nagging neuroticism will fade, at least on most days.
And Louise, one of the things I really admire about you is there are lots of cultural commentators who see the world with really kind of 20/20 clear vision and are very good at diagnosing the problems in our world, but maybe don't have many solutions. And then there are lots of people who, and not much hope. And then there are lots of people who are very hopeful about the world but don't often appear to grasp the gravity of the problems that we're facing or the challenges. Whereas you seem to be able to hold together a really clear grip on these are the real challenges that we're facing and these are the things to be aware of. And yet you seem to always write and speak with hope. And I just wonder what gives you that hope?
Yeah, hope in the long run, I suppose. Yeah, the line from scripture that I try and remind myself of is, be of good cheer because I've overcome the world. I think I have a tendency, I'm sure lots of people listening do, to lose my cheer. I'm glad that you find my work to be hopeful, because I don't always feel like that. But I think that trying to deliberately seeking out hope, I think, is a very good way to live your life, whether or not you're a cultural commentator. And also, in terms of my solutions, I'm not making them up myself. I'm just nicking them from a 2,000-year-old, religious tradition. So none of this is my own like creative genius. This is just straightforward. Like, what would the last chapter of my book? I think it's listen to your mother,
Yes.
or listen to your grandmother would serve just as well. If you just recognizing how strange a lot of our assumptions are right now in the mainstream, how historically unusual they are, how much of a break we've had with previous tradition, doesn't oblige you to go back and try and recreate the sexual norms of the 1550s or whatever it is. It doesn't oblige you to try and perfectly return in some way that's just not possible. It's more about spotting the way, it's trying to spot the commonalities across time and place and the ways in which we've forgotten those, and whether or not we could reform them in some way. And that's why I think that the listen to your grandmother point, so much of this is just would be regarded as common sense by people who hadn't lived in our strange era. And those people are still alive, and that, for now, and that wisdom is still available. So yes, no, you're not on your own. There's this whole well of human experience which can be called upon at any moment to think, how do we solve this human problem? Because everyone else has faced it before us. It's not just us.
Yeah, and you said, Louise, I know before about how actually it would have been a surprise to your teenage self that you would read the Bible and actually find it was quite helpful at diagnosing human challenges and human solutions and things like that, which is fascinating, really.
Yeah, well, it's the hubris of teenagers, isn't it? I haven't completely shrugged it off. I try.
And Louise, the other thing I just wanted to ask you about is with some of the challenges we're facing in this cultural moment. I mean, a friend of mine says secularism is facing a faith crisis, and there's this sense that some of the expectations and promises people felt that secularism was bringing to them, that if we can just squeeze enough of religion and faith in God out of our lives, then we'll live happy, fulfilled lives. People are finding that's not the case at all. Yeah. And people often finding themselves to be more anxious, more miserable. And so that's sparking this kind of return to faith, or people often seeking faith for the first time. Someone wrote a Reddit post about Oxford, where I minister, an atheist, very cross that so many of his friends were becoming Christians, and he said, I can't work out why they're rejecting the atheism of their parents and coming to faith. And I think that, so opinions differ in terms of the data, in terms of to quite what extent or quite how broadly that's happening, but there is something happening. And I just wonder what your perception on that is, and what hope, grounds for hope that might give us.
The thing about big social phenomena is that there's a significant time lag, because when something like the divorce revolution, say, hits people, right? It hits people in like the 70s, and then the real peak in divorce is in the 80s and 90s, and then it trails off mostly because people get married less often, and so. But it can seem that the benefits of that can often be delivered up front. And like, I'm not completely anti-divorce. Like, there clearly are some people for whom divorce is the right thing in cases of abuse or whatever, but there are actually a lot of people who end up regret getting divorced. There's data on this, and the effect of divorce on children can be really destructive, and I think it shouldn't surprise us that the generation who grew up, who were the children of the people who first experienced the divorce revolution, are anti-divorce. Like there's a time that it takes some time, some decades often, for the real effects of a sociological phenomena to play out and to become visible to people. And it may seem initially as if something's great and there are no trade-offs, and then actually you realise half a century later that the trade-offs are really severe, as it kind of trickles through. And I think that this is broadly true of the rejection of Christianity, of de-Christianization, which co-occurred with the sexual revolution. It's taken quite a long time, actually, for it to become clear quite how bad we are at not being religious, as a species, as well as a society. I mean, I think that we are religious creatures, and there are things that faith offers which aren't always obvious until you don't have them anymore. And I suppose the people now, people even younger than me, say they can look in a more clear-eyed way at where we are right now and where dechristianization has brought us, and reason. It doesn't have to be an emotional response. It can be an entirely rational response. They can reason that actually it was a mistake, and that now people are desperate to fill the God-shaped hole with politics or with other very poor replacements for belief. And yes, I think you'd struggle to find. I mean, even Richard Dawkins is now concedes that actually cultural Christianity had a lot to recommend it.
Yes, yeah. Louise, it's absolutely fascinating. I think we could continue this conversation for a long time, but we're so grateful for your time. And thank you so much for all your insights. It's so kind of you to join us. And so the new book is coming out, The New Guide to Sex in the 21st Century, which is like the young adults version of Case Against Sexual Revolution. People can track with you on the Wall Street Journal as well, on your weekly column, and also on the podcast Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, which is available everywhere. People get podcasts as well.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. I haven't spoken that so openly about my faith journey before, I think. So it's nice. It's good for me to order my own thoughts apart from anything else. So thank you for that opportunity.
Oh, no, thank you so much for us being part of your journey, Louise. And we're so grateful for everything you've shared. Great news. Louise is going to be joining us at the Leadership Conference this year. So I'd really encourage you to get your tickets as soon as you can. And thank you so much for joining us on The Thread on this episode. And we look forward to seeing you next time.